in the last couple of years, but my knowledge has been up.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Lest with the Tea We Forget with your hosts Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and Lillian Cauldwell. And today we're going to continue our discussion of the indigenous people of the United States and the U.S. government / citizens. And today we are going to have the program started with Lisa Skinner. So Lisa, take it away.
Thanks, Lillian. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here with us today. So I did a lot of research on the Native American boarding schools that were set up in the United States to eradicate and assimilate the Indian population once the white settlers came over from the European countries and decided they want this land to grow their cotton, and the Indians basically were in the way. So this is a continuation of our story that we brought to you last week, and this is specifically about the boarding schools that we set up to put them in. Last week, the U.S. Department of the Interior released a more than 100-page report on the federal indigenous boarding schools designed to assimilate Native Americans in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. So between 1819 and 1969, the U.S. ran or supported 408 boarding schools, the department found in their study. Students endured rampant physical, sexual, emotional abuse in these schools. And I'm just talking about the ones that existed in the U.S. They also were prevalent in Canada and other places. So there were 408 boarding schools just in the U.S. The schools were training these kids for certain kinds of low-paying jobs that would serve white Americans. So it was a system that emphasized social class. Is this all sounding familiar to our other series? Indian people were native but considered low class, who white people thought should learn some good manual trades that benefited them. The boarding schools were not really about benefiting the Native Americans. They were a form of segregated education in the history of the United States, and we know from other atrocities who really benefits from segregation. This is another example. Native American boarding schools, also known as Indian boarding schools, were established by the U.S. government in the late 19th century as an effort to assimilate indigenous youth into mainstream American culture through education. This era was part of the United States' overall attempt to kill, annihilate, or assimilate indigenous peoples and eradicate the indigenous culture. The Native American boarding schools first began operating in 1860 when the Bureau of Indian Affairs established the first on-reservation boarding school on the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington. Shortly after, the first off-reservation boarding school was established in 1879. This was the Carlisle Indian School, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and was founded by Richard Henry Pratt. He modeled the boarding school off an education program that he designed while overseeing Fort Marion Prison in St. Augustine, Florida. He developed the program after experimenting with Native American assimilation education on imprisoned and captive indigenous peoples. Pratt served as the headmaster of the Carlisle Indian School for 25 years and was famously known for his highly influential philosophy, which he described in a speech that he gave in 1892. He stated, and if you're not sitting down, sit down. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In a sense, he agrees with that sentiment, but only in this, he says that all the Indian there is in a race should be dead. So kill the Indian in him, but save the man. And this was the philosophy of what they wanted to do. Why waste good laborers just because they are of Native American culture? So we'll kill the Indian part and save the man so they can do manual labor for us that we're going to train them to do. Carlisle was significant because it was the model for other government boarding schools. It came early in the history, and a lot of the ideas for Indian education were tested out at the Carlisle School. For example, at the time, people thought Indians had to go into manual trades because they were good with their hands. They weren't educated to be doctors or lawyers or teachers. And so Carlisle had this program where students would spend half the day in the classroom, and then students would be trained in vocational work the other half of the day, and the other schools copied that model. Attendance to the boarding schools was made mandatory by the U.S. government, regardless of whether or not Indigenous families gave their consent. So even if the parents fought it, they mandated that they attended these schools. It was like being sent to prison, basically. Upon arrival, the Native American children were given Anglo-American names, bathed in kerosene, given military-style clothing in exchange for their traditional clothing, and their hair would be shaved off for the boys and cut into short bob styles for the girls. Education primarily focused on trades to make Native students marketable in American society. The male students were taught to perform manual labor such as blacksmithing, shoemaking, and farming, amongst other trades. On the other hand, female students were taught to cook, clean, sew, do laundry, and care for farm animals. Standard academic subjects like reading, writing, math, history, and art were also taught. However, these subjects emphasized American beliefs and values. For example, students were taught the importance of private property, materialized wealth. Students were forced to convert to Christianity and celebrate American holidays such as Columbus Day. Richard Henry Scott eventually implemented a placing out system that placed Native American students into American communities for a certain amount of time, varying from a summer to a full year. These programs tended to exploit students and use them for domestic and physical labor. Another example of slave labor. Native students were not allowed to speak their native languages. They were only allowed to speak English regardless of their fluency and would face punishment if they did not. The discipline enforced at these boarding schools was severe. Punishments varied and included privilege restrictions, diet restrictions, threats of corporal punishment, and even confinement. Additionally, Native students were neglected and faced many forms of abuse, including, again, physical, sexual, cultural, and spiritual. They were beaten, coerced into performing heavy labor. Their daily regimen consisted of several hours of marching, and recreational time consisted of watching disturbing movies about cowboys and Indians. And whose perspective do you think those movies were coming from? Yes, Hollywood's? Good guess. Since they were used as forms of punishment, since they were used to forms of punishment, food and medical attention was scarce. This led to boarding schools becoming more susceptible to infections and diseases like tuberculosis, the flu, and trachoma. Due to these conditions, the Native American students would become ill and die at these boarding schools often. They've just recently discovered mass graves at several of these schools. In 1899, a measles epidemic spread through the Phoenix Indian School, experiencing rates as high as 325 cases of measles, in addition to 60 cases of pneumonia and 9 student deaths within 10 days. Parents were rarely informed of their children's death. Some parents would learn of their child's death after they were buried in school cemeteries, and some students were buried in unmarked grave. This is one of the things that was recently discovered in this new report that came out. Those who survived these inhumane conditions were scarred for life from the traumatic experiences forever. Although a majority of Native children were forced to attend these boarding schools, some parents chose to send their children because they were the only schools available to Native American children. It was this or no schooling at all. However, several forms of resistance were performed in response to having their children pulled from these homes and forced to attend these boarding schools. Some forms of resistance included entire villages refusing to enroll their children in a boarding school, coordinated mass withdrawals, as well as encouraging their children to run away from the school. The Indian agents, who were the individuals hired to interact with indigenous communities on behalf of the U.S. government, would retaliate by holding rations and supplies to indigenous communities. These agents were also responsible for seizing children from their families and their homes until the boarding schools were filled. While the Native American boarding school era has now ended, the U.S. government still operates a few off-reservation boarding schools. As recently as 2020, 7 boarding schools continue to be federally funded, 3 of which are controlled by indigenous community leaders. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed to decrease U.S. federal control of Native affairs and instead allowed for Native self-determination and self-governance. An example of this transition can be seen with the Santa Fe Indian School, which was established in 1890 and originally implemented the Carlisle school model. By the 1920s, the school began transitioning after indigenous leaders fought to gain control over the school. It is currently managed by indigenous leaders, where the focus has switched to traditional arts and sovereignty, Native cultures, and community. Native youth, however, still face challenges within the American education system. They rarely have access to curriculums that are culturally relevant to them and experience difficulties in the classroom at alarming rates. According to reports given by Kids Count Data Center and the National Violent Death Reporting System, These are current statistics. Native students are 1.2 times more likely to be behind in 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. 1.4 times more likely to be suspended from school. 1.5 times more likely to die due to homicide or suicide. 1.7 times more likely to experience 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. 1.8 times more likely to attend a high poverty school, and 2 times more likely to drop out of high school. These are the current statistics as of this current year. The tragedies Native children face during this era have impacted the lives of not only the children, but also their families and their communities. These impacts have caused Indigenous communities to experience deep-rooted ramifications in regard to mental health and the overall relationship between Native communities and the American education system. They are often displayed in the form of poverty, difficulties in the American education system, poor physical health, and poor mental health. Many Native students who survived the boarding school era went on to suffer from continued mental health and other related issues such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, a lack of cultural identity, and the development of negative stereotypes. For example, they're lazy, they're alcoholics, etc. These are all stigmas that they live by today. And that's just to name a few. These traumatic experiences have been passed down from generation to generation and continue to impact Indigenous communities today. There are several documentaries that I have listed here if you're interested in doing some further exploration into this boarding school topic. One of them is called Unspoken: America's Native American Boarding Schools, and it was a documentary produced by PBS Utah. Another one is Unseen Tears: The Native American Boarding School Experience in Western New York, 2009. And then there's some literature that has been recommended on the topic. One I think is pretty well known is called The Code Talker, the first and only memoir by one of the original Navajo code talkers of World War II by Chester Nez and Judith Scheiss Avila. Education for Extinction: American Indians and the Boarding School Experience, 1875 to 1928 by David Wallace Adams. They called it Prairie Light: The Story of Chillicothe Indian School by K. Tatiana Loma Waima. And then finally, Pipestone: My Life in an Indian Boarding School by Adam Fortunate Eagle. So those are all some additional resources for you if you'd like to do some more research on this topic. So I will now turn the microphone over to Lillian. And Lillian, if you want to add to anything that I shared with the audience or comment, it's your.
There are several memoirs written by children of these women. The boys were left alone, at least here in the States. Mostly the boys in Canada were rounded up with the girls, but in the States they concentrated on the girls. And I was in the middle of working on one of them, and as Lisa described it, that's what happened to her mother. And she brought her drama or her post-stress That happens to our soldiers when they come home from war in Afghanistan or Iraq. And she had the same problems emotionally, physically, and mentally, so that she spent a great deal of her time in and out of psychiatric units. So remember that they may have a dark skin color, but they're human and their mind is fragile. And if you start abusing somebody at a young age, chances are they will transfer it when they get older because they don't know any other way of maintaining a relationship between mother and daughter and mother and father and daughter and daughter to sibling. Now, the movie I'm watching that came recommended for me to see takes place after the Civil War. Actually takes place in 1923. That's the name of the movie. It is based on a book, 1923, and it encompasses not only the plight of American children being forced to going to the boarding Christian schools, but it also discusses the plight of the cattlemen versus the sheepmen. And when you see the range wars and what these men do to each other, it peels the paint from your eyes, is the only way I can explain it. It's probably just as well this was not taught in American history, because I believe that more than 2/3 of the class who are Scottish or Irish would have walked right out, because those are the people who herded sheep on the Great Plains. And yes, it's before the Great Depression, although there are symbolic scenes where all you can see is dust rising behind either the cattlemen or the sheepmen. These people were vicious. I mean, a sheepman was hung with his group of men by the cattlemen. He managed to escape, so he comes back with a submachine gun and he lets the cattlemen have it. Really? What does that remind you of? Oh, yes, our notorious outlaws that the United States has the bad habit of turning into heroes. Well, at least we get it honestly. That's what the British did with Robin Hood, actually. He wasn't quite the nice guy that myth and legend made him to be. So the only thing I really have to add is you really need to understand that it's not just the Germans who annihilated people because of their race or their color or their religion. We did the same thing because we are human. And humans have a way of wanting to always be on the top rung. And if anybody gets in their way, they consider themselves above the law, above the food chain, and that gives them the right to kill anyone who gets in their way. So let's hear from Betsy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Lisa. What information. And I'll tell you, I can't speak for anyone else but myself, but I have learned so much from the research that Lillian and Lisa have done. And I watched a video which was about the Carlisle School, so I'm not going to go into that because Lisa already covered that. But the name of the video that I watched was How the U.S. Stole Thousands of Native American Children. I had no idea what actually went on I heard about the boarding schools maybe a year or two ago, but really not to the extent that I know now. Not only did this guy Pratt start this boarding school, he also did propaganda. He would show pictures of before and after. And he called the Indian children, the Native Americans, savages. What I saw in this video made me so upset that this is such a dark blemish, and that's an understatement in American history. And I don't care if people get mad at me or not. That's the way it is, folks. This is what happened. It's still happening. We had a Holocaust here on U.S. soil, and we did it to the Native Americans. Not only were they put in the boarding schools, as Lisa mentioned, but when some of these boarding schools started to close up, they wanted to still take away the Native American children from their parents. And as Lisa said, and I had the same quote, kill the Indian and save the man. There was, I think in 1957, 58, they started the adoption era of white people adopting Native American children. These children were ripped from their families. They had no choice. And social workers would come and they would take these children. They even had the propaganda in newspapers and magazines. It is a disgrace. Can you imagine someone taking away your child because of your ethnic background, because of your culture? They were stripped of their language, of their culture. They did interview some Native Americans in this video, and they did have problems. There was abuse in some of these foster homes or adoption homes, and it just isn't right, folks. It's not right. It just turned to my stomach. When it comes to children, I get very verklempt. That's the only way I could put it. I get very emotional. So in 1977 to 78, there was the Indian Children, can't read my own handwriting, Indian Children Act. I can't read my handwriting. Sorry, folks. That's what Indian Children Child Welfare Act. That's it. Can't read my own handwriting. And people testified in 1974 about social workers coming to their home and taking their children. And these parents found out later that their children didn't have a better life, not necessarily, but they were being abused. How awful is that? Can you imagine being pregnant and a social worker coming and saying, we're going to take your child away? These children weren't necessarily abused in their homes. They thought by, I would say, white standards, white American standards, that these children were abused because the families, they lived together. You might have several generations living in a home, might have been overcrowded. That happened in other cultures too, where multi-generational families lived together. Did they take away those children? No. And being ripped apart from their family. And it did leave a scar on these individuals. One woman said she became a drug addict. And as Lillian mentioned, it's generational. You know, hurt people hurt people. Crap, rolls downhill. If you're getting treated like crap, you're going to treat someone else like crap. If you're being abused and you're hurt, that's going to be, it goes forward until it's stopped, until there's education to stop it. And I was really appalled to find out this information. I feel really bad for the Native Americans. And if there's any Native Americans and you're listening, I apologize on behalf the United States of America, because I just think it's awful. Let's have some empathy and how you would feel if this happened to you. If you were a child and you knew enough that you remembered your mom and dad and you were taken away for no other reason but you're an American Indian, a Native American. And that's what I have to say. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Lisa and Lillian, for coming up with this idea for the show and all the research. And I really have learned a lot. So thank you for opening up my eyes. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Here's one thing I might like to add. Remember the orphan trains when they gathered all the kids that were living on the streets of New York City and they put them on trains and they shipped them out west? They did the same thing with those kids who were homeless and living on the street. They were taken by most ranchers and farmers to use them as slave labor. Remember those Mexican and South American kids that were taken from the immigrants 2 years ago and absorbed into our system? It was supposed to be for the good of the parents. Guess what? They still haven't found a lot of these kids yet to be reunited with their parents. It makes you think that perhaps the time has come that women need to get together and say, enough is enough. No man should have the right to take a child from grandparents, grandmothers, parents, if there's nothing wrong with the culture, the society, and most importantly, if that child is being cared for. And I too apologize to the American indigenous people. My previous people who dated me, I always forget that word, didn't come here until when they were fleeing from Germany. But I'm sure that if I look far enough along, I'll find a friend's ancestors running around, probably being involved. And I just think that we as citizens should demand the truth of history. Otherwise, we will keep on doing what we're doing, and worse, we will take it to the stars. Lisa, please provide your email address so if people would like to ask you questions or find out more, they can contact you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you can contact me at my email address, which is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. I'm also the host of the Alzheimer's Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's show. So that's where that email comes from. But one thing that I just want to add, this whole baby actually was Lillian's creation, and I was honored to be asked to be part of it. She included both myself and Betsy in to help her raise the awareness about these topics that we're talking about. So I feel very privileged to be a part of this show because I think it is so, so important. And I hope everybody is also realizing the value of this information that we are digging out of the grave and bringing forward to you. Our intention for this whole show, the whole objective of this show, is to lead that elephant out of the attic where it's been hiding for generations and put it smack dab back into the center of the room where it's in our face, it's not going away, and people have to recognize that just as Lillian's vision was of the whole purpose of the show. History does keep repeating itself. We are supporting that and proving that that's the way it is. So instead of sweeping these atrocities under the carpet that we've seen happen, the Japanese internment camps, the denial that the Holocaust ever even happened, and the genocide of the indigenous people, all of these things that we have been bringing to you since we started this series, these are all factual. They are real. They happened. And we don't want people to forget that they did. So we're bringing the elephant back in the room for everybody to realize that somewhere along the line, something has to change with the way we get along with other people, and stop trying to eradicate them because they're different than we are.
Thank you. Betsy? Email?
Hi, everyone. Yes, my email is sloan.betsy31@gmail.com. And I agree with what Lisa has to say. And Lillian, we need to bring these uncomfortable topics up. We need to talk about them till they do become comfortable to talk about. And I had to add something that I forgot to say when I was discussing about the adoption. These parents didn't agree. They were penalized. They didn't have their food rations. They did, the government made their life miserable. Some of these parents camped out near their schools to be near their children. It's really mind-boggling that this happened in the U.S. And we need to talk about it, because if we don't remember our past, we're going to keep repeating it. And it seems like we do keep repeating it. One generation after another, one cultural versus another culture of immigrants. It just keeps going on and on. We had to stop the hatred. And that's what how I feel. And I am very honored to be part of this show. And so thank you for the opportunity, Lillian, and coming up with the idea and asking me to join you and Lisa. And that's what I have to say. So folks, please listen to the show. Not only listen to it, but share it so we can bring our humanity back. Let's bring back, I might be a child of the hippies. Let's bring back our love and humanity. Where is our humanity today? We need to start loving up on each other and being good human beings to each other. And that's what I have to say. Thank you for joining us today.
Lillian Cauldwell, PWR Network LLC @gmail.com. Our call to action to you, our audience, is to don't wait until it's in your own backyard, because it will be too late. If you're hearing rhetoric from a political candidate who's already telling you, if you send me to jail, I'll get even, you won't need the Justice Department or the Supreme Court because I am the law. I hope you're thinking through what he's implying and think twice about some of these terrorist groups that are springing up to get their message across. There is a huge group of fascists in this country. So my call to action to you is, number one, look to your past and decide if there's something that you want Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and I, Lillian Cauldwell, to bring out into the light. And number two, if there's something going on where history is repeating itself in your hometown, and what would you consider a repeat of history? maybe the KKK marching down the middle of the street, maybe having fascists walk down the street, maybe having people say to you, you're transgender, therefore you are banned from sports. It kind of reminds me that when the new type of artificial legs were attached to soldiers, that they had larger feet because they were using metal on the bottom to study their prosthetics. And people were afraid that that would give them an undue advantage, therefore they should be banned. Or perhaps burning books down in Florida because the conservatives are so afraid that they want us to return to the dark ages. You don't have to wait for somebody to invade this country. We're doing a very good job all by ourselves because we're repeating the history that former ancestors have done before. So please, I want to thank both Betsy and Lisa for joining me on this journey. I selected each one of them because they have strong voices. They're women of conviction and they don't stand down. They're the kind of people you want when you're sent to the lion's den and chummed with bait before the lions attack you. So on that note, thank you very much for listening to Lest We Forget on Passionate World Talk Radio Network, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. You can hear this all over again when Jeannie White, the station manager, posts it on our blog, and she will provide you with links on Bitly, and you'll also hear it on youtube.com, facebook.com/live, and all 12 major podcast video directories. Thank you very much. And next week, we will be talking about manifest destiny and the United States. Thank you.